There's over 5 million beekeepers around the planet. They're in their bees all the time. They're looking. It's not like we're not examining bees. But nobody has done a systematic assessment of what makes a colony. How big does it get? How long does the queen live? We started officially with Project Genesis to get a baseline on what the bees, what normal colonies would go through for a full season of bees. That information has really never been kept on any long-term basis, so we're now in our 12th year of Project Genesis. We have 20 colonies in Project Genesis, and every 2 weeks we take complete survey of everything that's in the colony. We look at all 20 frames and the brood frames of these colonies, and we see the condition of the queen. We see how much brood is in the colony, how much stores, how much pollen. We remark on any sort of health issue. We weigh the colonies so we know whether they're gaining honey or losing, eating into their stores. And we've counted mites every 2 weeks, which is something that beekeepers generally don't do. They know they have mites, they don't bother to count them. And some of the myths that we were able to disprove were, for example, that if you had 10 colonies in one location, that all of the colonies would have equal amount of mites because of drift between the colonies. So if you had one colony, you only had to measure one, and then all the colonies would have the same number of mites. And very quickly, the first year and every year since then, we found out that's not true. You can have a colony that has a completely overwhelming number of mites right next to a colony that has almost no mites. So that was an example of some of the myths around it, because people simply hadn't checked. The common knowledge is that varroa mites are causing the bees to die. And so it's recommended that you put chemicals into the colony to kill the varroa mites that somehow keep from killing the bees. And originally our study was to compare colonies that didn't get any treatment with colonies that did. And we wanted to see what the survivability was between those. It's not been proven that mites are actually killing the bees. It's a logical conclusion that people, a matter of faith, that they've decided that's what it is, but nobody really knows the exact thing. So if you apply chemicals in your colony, it's quite possible that those chemicals are actually causing harm that wouldn't be there if you hadn't put the chemicals in there. So one of the things we're trying to do is tackle long-term studies that will allow us to get some of those answers. So to have 20 colonies that we basically just measure throughout the entire season, we don't try to keep them from dying if they're sick, if they have what we call the grunge. We just document how long does that take. Does it necessarily mean that that colony is going to die? What happens if we don't treat? How many, do the mites go up? What are those numbers? Those things have not been checked. We are trying to get a searchable dynamic database that can get all of the information we've collected for the last 12 years onto the internet where everybody can access that. They'll have their own questions about, how many mites, when do the mites peak, what happens if you don't treat, does the number go down on its own, or does a colony absolutely die at a certain number? Questions like that, I think we've got in our data, but we don't have the ability right now to share that knowledge with the world. People ask me, why haven't we come up with an answer of what is killing the bees? And one of the reasons is we don't really have the facilities that will allow us to answer the question. I think what we need is a central location that can do testing for all of these things. Should be able to say, if they didn't die of a virus, was it a bacteria? If it wasn't a bacteria, was it a chemical? Which particular chemical? If it's none of those, what is it about the genetics of these bees? What is their genetic profile? And maybe it was the stock of bees had something to do with it. There is no place right now that can analyze bee tissue. We are seeing a problem with flight muscles, which the bees also use to heat themselves. So bees not making it through the winter could very well be that their wing muscles are not functioning right. There is no place on this planet that I can send a sample to find out why their wings aren't functioning. There needs to be a laboratory that can do that sort of analysis and get down to it, or we're not going to find an answer to what's killing the honeybees. Such a place does not exist at this point, where all of that is in one location that can answer all of those questions. I would like to see the center be able to serve as a central communication point for all entomologists and beekeepers around the world. So we have a open source and non-proprietary philosophy that all of this information should be free to anybody who's interested in looking at it, so that all the research that's being done in the world, we are aware of it. We have the papers and the connections and so on. So if someone has a question in a particular field, we can hook those two together. And I think it would be very easy to have computer banks that would basically serve as a library or a data bank, basically, of everything that's out there, so that we would be able to put the pieces together for people and facilitate communication among researchers all over the planet. That would just be part and parcel of the things that we would do here. And my thinking is, if we can figure out what's killing the little tiny bugs, these little tiny amounts might be causing us a lot of harm too, but we need to find out if they're harmful. And one of the things we did 5 years ago, we had a symposium on glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, which everyone uses because everyone knows it's perfectly safe. So we spray it on everything because we don't want to weed or go to the hard work that used to be to get those kind of things out of our gardens. So we just spray an herbicide on it, which is supposed to be okay. Well, glyphosate doesn't break down. Its half-life is 7 years, which means it's probably going to be in an environment for up to 50 years before it breaks down. And we're spraying 10 times as much as we did the previous year, and we've been doing that for the last 15 years. So is that a problem? I don't know. If it's causing a problem with the bees, we are certainly eating glyphosate now because it's sprayed on all of our crops. It can't be taken out of the food when it's produced, so we are getting those quantities in everything we eat right now, and we don't know for sure that it's absolutely safe. Beekeepers are losing 30 to 40% is a conservative estimate. Many of them are losing over 50% of their bees that don't make it through the winter. A lot of people don't know that we have to pay commercial beekeepers to load their colonies onto semis and truck them into these big farms so that there's insects available to pollinate the crops that we're eating. And we would not have that without honeybees. It didn't used to be that way. We used to have native pollinators. And what they have to do is buy more bees from bee providers, or they might grow more queens. We call them nucleus colonies. It's basically like a puppy farm. We take one colony and we divide them into many and then try to grow those colonies into an adult colony before winter comes again, and then we lose half again. And we have been doing that for 20 years now, and we've done it successfully enough to say that basically all of our crops are getting pollinated. But there may come a year when we don't successfully recoup all of our losses and there aren't enough bees to go around, and then suddenly cherries in the grocery store are going to cost $50 a pound, and watermelons are not going to be available, and people are going to say, what happened? And right now, if we lose the honeybees, we're going to be in a food desert in the grocery stores. The insects are down 20% of what they were 20 years ago. They're just the mass of all types of bugs, and most people are very happy to not have to deal with the bugs, but that is the bottom of the food chain. The insects get fed on by other critters, bigger critters feed on those, and so on. So at some point, that's going to be a problem. If we wipe out all of the environmental balance by the use of chemicals that we're careless in finding out what their effects are, then we could possibly back ourselves into a corner that we can't get out of. In my view, anything that's survived and flourished for 50 million years and co-evolved with flowers, suddenly in the last 2 decades is now in trouble of possibly going away. It might be something that humans are doing. And so if we can figure out what that is that's hurting the bees, we'll probably be helping ourselves and heading off some disaster down the way.